Finally, this is the Calvinist critique that I've been waiting for. Ever since leaving the Calvinist perspective back in 2018, and especially since starting Rev Reads in 2020, I've read several critiques of Calvinist theology, critiques of varying quality. I think the two best that I read so far are Calvinism, a biblical and theological critique edited by Allen and Lemke, and Deconstructing Calvinism by Hudson Smelly. Although Determined to Believe by John Lennox is right up there as well. Well, I have a new review of a Calvinism critique today. This one is by Ronnie Rogers, and it's called Does God Love All or Some? With the subtitle Comparing Biblical Extensivism and Calvinism's Exclusivism. This is a 2019 release by WIPF and Stock. Now, I'm going to be honest and say that I first saw this book earlier, a few years ago, and I passed on it because I had recently finished David Allen's The Extent of the Atonement. And I thought that this book would also be on limited or universal atonement. And now I'm kind of sad I passed on it for that reason, because this book is much more on unconditional election than limited atonement, although this is definitely a critique on the entire Reformed system of soteriology. And what I love about this book is how Rogers, instead of covering the standard, well-worn path of critiquing the 5 points of TULIP in order to demonstrate how they are not biblical, Rogers covers the topics that, and I share this with him, the topics that are the foundational truths of Calvinism. And he also spends significant time calling out Calvinists to be honest in their presentations of their own beliefs, thereby letting others know that there are times when Calvinists don't communicate what they really believe, and it's helpful for you to be able to spot when that is occurring. Overall, I really enjoyed this book. I thought it was very well written by Rogers. It's just as good as his book on prayer, if only you would ask. And if you have just a few more minutes, I would like to tell you a little bit more about Does God Love All or Some? Welcome to Rev Reads. If you want to discover more books that will help you to understand the love of God for all those made in his image, please subscribe to the channel to stay up with my latest book review. Also, like and share this video. It's your likes, your shares that helps others know about the work of Ronnie Rogers. In July of 2025, I will be teaching in Burundi, East Africa, at the Grace Initiative for Burundi. Each year, Grace Life Ministries hosts a pastoral training for 100 to 120 pastors in Burundi. And as one of the instructors, I will be delivering tools for pastoral ministry that these men can't find anywhere else in their country. And if you would like to support this pastoral training, please follow the link in the description below. Go to gracelife.org/give so that you can help contribute to the training of local pastors in Africa. Does God love all or some? Is both a critique of Calvinism and a presentation of Rogers' own view of soteriology, which he presents as extensivism. If you're not familiar with the term, extensivism is the belief that man, created in the image of God, has otherwise choice. You can choose between options. And God's salvation plan through the complete work of Jesus Christ is comprehensive, with an all-inclusive, unconditional offer of salvation and security, reception of which is conditioned on grace-enabled faith. Unlike Calvinism, where the difference between the redeemed and the reprobate is based on God's choice of the individual without any regard to anything concerning that person, including their faith in Jesus Christ. Therefore, under Calvinism, the reprobate is damned because God ordained not to make salvation a possibility for that person. When someone makes election unconditional, salvation is not then in regard to their faith in Jesus Christ. And reprobation also is not in regard to their sinfulness, because the choice that God made was to save them or to damn them without any relation to that person's life. That's election without conditions. Extensivism, on the other hand, teaches that God has made salvation available through faith in Christ, and you have a genuine offer of salvation to every person. And it's man's role to believe or reject the gospel message that has been sent by God's grace. Now, reading this book, I would now call myself an extensivist. I'd put myself in that camp. I think the only significant point of departure that I would have from Rogers is his desire to save the term total depravity, hold on to that, even though he's not a Calvinist, but I'm comfortable letting them have it and teaching that total depravity isn't a biblical concept. Being a sinner who is at enmity with God on account of your own sin, that is not the same as the Calvinist teaching of total depravity. I think there's three great things about this book that I would like to highlight. First, Rogers covers a ton of ground. This book is filled with 34 relatively brief chapters for a 250-page book, and Rogers writes in a really tight fashion that allows him to cover so many different areas relating to God's love for the world and the gospel offer and the nature of man and on and on, issues that aren't typically covered in a lot of critiques of Calvinism. Second is Rogers' call for Calvinists to be honest regarding their beliefs. I mentioned this in a recent review I did on Graham Goldworthy's In These Last Days, because he used a phrase in his book that was also used by D.A. Carson and is mentioned by Rogers in this book. And that is the phrase that's used by Calvinists: there is no contradiction between God's sovereignty and man's free will. Now, this is a dishonest claim when used by Calvinists like Carson. And the reason it's dishonest is because no one in the church believes there is a contradiction between God's ruling over his creation as the sovereign and man acting with the freedom of the will to choose this day to serve God or rebel against him. The debate is instead in the place of, does God determine or ordain all the choices of man, so that our will is only a necessity resulting from what God has already ordained for us? It's dishonest about their beliefs and their extreme view of how God's sovereignty works to simply state there's no contradiction between God's sovereignty and man's free will. This statement by Goldsworthy and Carson makes it appear that Calvinism holds the same view as the rest of the church regarding the reign of God and the will of man. But instead, their view is an extreme view that teaches that God ordains in time what his word in the Holy Scriptures prohibits. Carson and others should be honest about where the debate lies. And there's many other places where this dishonesty and manipulative language is used to hide or obscure the views of the Roman Reformed Church, and Rogers does a good job bringing out all of this manipulative language. The third thing I really love about this book is Rogers' explanation of how God's foreknowledge relates to man's choices. Excellent stuff here. Many of the Reformed argue that for God to foreknow something, he must also foreordain it, or that it is through his foreordination of all things that he knows all things. The first thing I want to mention is that this is a philosophical argument and not a scriptural argument. And Rogers clearly and capably teaches how God's knowledge is perfect. So God has always known what we would choose, not because of a foreordination of our choices, but because his knowledge is perfect. Of what he knows we will, or what he knows we will not choose. God's foreknowledge of our choices don't make our choices necessary, as in, I must choose to be anxious about tomorrow's weather because I can do no other, because God has ordained my anxiety in his foreknowledge. Instead, my choices are certain. I will be anxious about tomorrow's weather because I failed to pray. And it is certain that because God knows that I will fail to pray, that it will result in my anxiety and sin against him. Now, the two may appear to be very similar, but they are instead vastly different. Because in one, God is ordaining that I will sin through his active or passive will, doesn't really make much of a difference, or through secondary causes. But in the other situation, the one that's brought out by Rogers in this book and the one that I share, God wills for me to obey him. Yet I have rebelled against what he ordained for me to do. He simply knows what it is that I will do in my rebellion. Now, I hope that my summary and my illustration does justice to the longer explanation by Rogers, but it was really good. Overall, this is my favorite book that argues against the biblical and philosophical foundations of Calvinism and Reformed theology. I think Rogers hits on the most important fundamental issues, and I will recommend this book often in the future. Does God love all? Oh, yes, he does. And Rogers' book on this subject is a home